Welcome to the deep dive. We have an incredibly fascinating and honestly really provocative journey ahead of us today.
We really do.
Yeah, and I want to specifically welcome those of you in the audience who identify with the men's rights movement and the red-pilled manosphere. We know you are looking for thorough, unfiltered analysis, and that is exactly what we are delivering. But before we get into the weeds, I need you to do me a quick favor. Immediately hit that like button and subscribe to the deep dive. It helps us keep bringing you these ultra-long, incisive breakdowns that you simply won't find anywhere else.
Right. It is essential to support the platforms that take these complex, often controversial topics seriously. The material we're covering today requires a massive amount of unpacking because it fundamentally challenged the mainstream narrative surrounding modern society, dating, and interpersonal dynamics.
That is the perfect way to frame it. Our mission today is to conduct an extensive, ultra-long review of Conrad Riker's 2024 ebook, Elevate Your Love Life, Marry Above Your Station. We're going to hook you into this material because, according to the author, this book is an absolute must-buy for men who are seeking to understand the hidden, often unspoken rules of the modern dating market.
It really is positioned as a strategic manual.
Exactly. It's a manual for how to reclaim your masculinity and understand the history of our social institutions before, as the author argues, they were completely captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies.
It's a dense, highly strategic text. The core thesis essentially argues that the modern game of love and marriage is rigged against the average man. But if you understand the underlying kindness, the biology, the economics, the social dynamics, and the institutional history, you can rewrite your own outcomes and build a legacy.
Now, if you want to follow along, or if you want to read the source material for yourself, I strongly urge you to check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the book right now. You can also follow the author, at Conrad Riker on Substack, for his ongoing strategies and unfiltered thoughts. But before we get into the mechanics of how he breaks down the dating market, we need to set some very clear parameters for this discussion.
I agree completely. Given the nature of this text, setting the stage is paramount.
Because this source material contains highly politically charged content regarding gender dynamics, feminism, and what the author describes as cultural Marxism, we must offer a clear impartiality disclaimer. Both of us will be impartially reporting on the content provided in this book. We want to make it explicitly clear to you, the listener, that we are not taking sides. We are not endorsing the viewpoints of the content, nor are we condemning them. We are simply breaking down Riker's fascinating and provocative strategies so that you can fully grasp the ideas contained in the original text. Our job is to be your guides through his worldview.
That is exactly our role. We are examining the architecture of the arguments presented in the book. We will look at the data cited, the historical parallels drawn, and the psychological frameworks applied. Whether you align with these conclusions or fundamentally oppose them, the goal here is complete comprehension of the text so you can make up your own mind.
Okay, let's unpack this. We are going to explore the harsh economic realities of the modern dating market, delve deeply into the evolutionary biology driving human attraction, and then look at the deployment of stoicism as a survival tool.
Right.
From there, we'll analyze the mechanics of identifying truly high-value women, and finally, we will break down the ultimate framework for marriage and legacy. To start, the book paints a pretty bleak picture of the current landscape, describing it as a gynocracy. But how does the text actually define that term in practice, and how does it relate to the institutional capture mentioned earlier?
Well, the term gynocracy, as utilized in this framework, refers to a social system where women hold the ultimate deciding power, particularly in the realm of dating, mating, and social narratives. The author argues that this power imbalance has resulted in a culture where men are frequently vilified simply for exhibiting natural masculinity.
Wow. Yeah.
Yet simultaneously, they're expected to perform traditional masculine roles when it comes to providing, protecting, and initiating. It's described as a societal double bind where you are punished for being a traditional man, but rejected if you aren't one.
And a massive part of this, according to the book, is the technological shift. I mean, we all know about swipe culture and the gamification of courtship, but the author goes deeper than just complaining about dating apps. He brings in the Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule, and applies it directly to the dating market.
Yes, the 80-20 rule.
The claim is that 80% of women are actively chasing the top 20% of men. But let me play devil's advocate for a second. If 80% of women are holding out for only 20% of men, how does the author explain the fact that marriages and relationships do still happen outside of that top tier? Does the math actually hold up in his worldview?
It's a great question, and the book addresses it by looking at the timeline of the modern dating market. Yes, relationships eventually form, but the text argues they form much later, often after immense frustration and frequently under compromised circumstances. If we connect this to the bigger picture, social media, reality television, and Instagram influencers have completely warped the baseline of what is considered an average or acceptable partner.
Oh, absolutely.
A woman living in a mid-sized town historically only compared the men in her immediate vicinity. Now, her digital window exposes her daily to curated images of ultra-successful, highly attractive men living luxurious lifestyles. This constant exposure hyperinflates female expectations. So, the 80-20 rule isn't necessarily saying only 20% of men ever get married. It's saying that in the prime dating years, the vast majority of female attention and desire is intensely concentrated on that top quintile.
Which means the other 80% of guys are effectively invisible in the digital landscape. And because our audience is well aware of the dynamics of the manosphere, we don't need to define basic terms like ghosting, benching, or breadcrumbing. But what is fascinating is why the book claims these behaviors have become the absolute default strategy for modern women. It's not just bad manners, it's an economic inevitability.
Precisely. When you have an artificially inflated sense of supply, meaning a woman feels she has access to thousands of top-tier men via screen, the perceived value of any individual connection drops to near zero. Ghosting and orbiting aren't just rude. They are mechanisms of a hyper-efficient, ruthless marketplace.
That makes a lot of sense.
If a woman is constantly searching for a higher value match within that top 20%, keeping several men benched or orbiting provides emotional validation and a safety net without requiring any actual commitment or investment. It's a strategy of optimization.
And this ties directly into the concept of institutional capture. The book argues that this imbalance isn't just an accident of technology, it's been actively fostered by cultural Marxism and feminist ideologies that have permeated our institutions. The text claims these ideologies deliberately push the narrative of toxic masculinity to keep men off balance. The argument is that the moment men accept this narrative and become soft and vulnerable, they completely lose their sexual market value.
The author treats toxic masculinity as a misandrist construct designed to emasculate. The text argues that the original goal of feminism, equal opportunity, was achieved decades ago, and the movement has since morphed into a mechanism of control. It demands men suppress their innate competitive and dominant traits.
Right.
But the paradox the book highlights is that while society tells men to be vulnerable and in touch with their feelings, the biological reality of the dating market brutally punishes them for it. The moment a man cries or shows deep insecurity, the book asserts his partner's biological attraction plummets because he is no longer perceived as a capable protector.
The book also takes a massive swing at some deeply entrenched mainstream economic narratives to prove this point about systemic misandry. Let's talk about the wage gap myth. The mainstream narrative is that women make roughly 80 cents for every dollar a man makes due to systemic sexism. How does the author dismantle that specific statistic?
Well, the book completely rejects the systemic sexism argument by looking at the raw variables behind the data. The author points out that when economists account for career choices, hours worked, willingness to relocate, and risk factors, the gap effectively vanishes. A key statistic cited is that men make up over 90% of workplace fatalities.
90%, wow.
Yes, men disproportionately take the dangerous, physically demanding, high-stress jobs logging, deep-sea fishing, oil rigging, high-wire electrical work that inherently pay more due to the extreme risk. The text argues that the wage gap is not a product of discrimination, but of differing life choices and the societal expectation that men must take on greater burdens to act as providers.
He also tackles the so-called pink tax. The idea that products marketed to women, like razors or dry cleaning, are unfairly priced higher. The author essentially laughs this off, arguing that this financial burden actually adds another layer to the power dynamics because men are still societally expected to be the primary breadwinners and foot the bill for these elevated lifestyle costs. The man is expected to pay for the dates, the engagement ring, the lifestyle, and yet is told he is part of an oppressive patriarchy.
Furthermore, the book deeply critiques the #MeToo movement and its lasting impact on corporate and social environments. While acknowledging that it exposed some genuine horrific abuses of power, the author argues it has concurrently created a climate of immense fear and presumed guilt for the average man. The text posits that men are now terrified to initiate romantic interactions, mentor female colleagues, or express traditional courtship behaviors, feeling that a single misinterpretation could result in total professional and social annihilation.
Yeah, the rules completely change.
And this climate, he argues, has effectively paralyzed the natural dynamics of male initiation, handing all the leverage over to women.
And the data he uses to illustrate this leverage is pretty stark. He brings up divorce statistics, specifically the fact that 80% of divorces are initiated by women. The argument here is that the current legal framework, particularly family courts, makes marriage a highly asymmetrical risk for men. But he also uses a really interesting geographic visualization to prove the supply and demand imbalance. Talk to me about the witching hour in New York City.
This is a brilliant demographic illustration. The author points out that in major metropolitan areas like New York City, college-educated, single women vastly outnumber single men of a similar demographic. At bars and high-end clubs, particularly late at night during what he calls the witching hour, the supply and demand imbalance is physically visible. You have throngs of successful, attractive women competing for the attention of a very small pool of high-value men.
It's insane to picture that.
Right. High-value men in these environments are the scarce resource. Yet because the societal narrative constantly tells women they are the prize and men are the oppressors, the average man is left completely confused about his own worth, while the women are frustrated that the top-tier men won't commit.
Which means if you are a man operating in this environment, you have to understand the invisible rules governing these interactions.
Yeah.
You can't just rely on what society tells you. You have to look under the hood.
And that brings us to evolutionary biology. The book posits that gender equality in dating is an absolute myth because men and women are biologically wired completely differently by millions of years of Darwinian sexual selection. I know he mentions waist-to-hip ratios and pheromones, but how deep does he actually go into the science here?
He goes incredibly deep into evolutionary psychology. He draws heavily on the fundamental differences in reproductive investment. In biological terms, sperm is abundant, constantly replenished, and biologically cheap to produce. A man could theoretically father thousands of children. Eggs, however, are finite.
Very finite. Exactly. A woman is born with a set number, and gestating a child requires a massive 9-month bodily investment, followed by years of vulnerable nursing and rearing. Because the biological cost of reproduction is astronomically higher for women, their evolutionary mating strategy is inherently far more selective and ruthless.
So it's not about society conditioning us with Disney movies. It's about ancient survival mechanisms. Men and women are literally looking for different biological markers. For instance, the book explains that men subconsciously look for specific physical traits in women that indicate youth and fertility. And the most famous metric he brings up is the 0.7 waist-to-hip ratio.
Yes, the 0.7 waist-to-hip ratio, where the waist is 70% the circumference of the hips, is an hourglass figure. But the text emphasizes that this isn't just a cultural beauty standard that changes with the decades. Evolutionary biologists have found that this specific ratio is a deeply ingrained biological signal.
It's hardwired.
It indicates high estrogen, high fertility, optimal fat distribution for brain development and offspring, and a lower risk of chronic diseases like diabetes or cardiovascular issues. When a man sees that ratio, his lizard brain instantly registers healthy, fertile mate.
Right. And conversely, women are wired to look for entirely different markers. While a man's physical health matters, the book argues that women are evolutionarily programmed to seek out status, resources, and testosterone-driven dominance. It's about securing a protector and a provider. Historically, a woman's survival, and the survival of her offspring in a harsh environment, depended on securing a mate who could defend them from predators and rival tribes, and who had the social status to command resources.
Exactly. And the text argues that modern women, despite living in safe, industrialized societies with their own bank accounts, still operate on this ancient biological hardware. A woman might be a CEO, but her nervous system is still wired to be attracted to a man who exhibits assertive, dominant, protective traits. This leads directly to the core concept of hypergamy, the innate biological drive for a woman to marry up.
Hypergamy is a term our audience is definitely familiar with, but the book really emphasizes how it dictates everyday interactions. A woman is biologically driven to secure the highest possible value mate available to her. She is constantly evaluating a man's assets, his social position, and his genetic fitness. And this is where the concept of shit tests comes in. We know what they are, but break down the psychology behind why a woman feels compelled to test a man's frame.
It goes back to that need for a capable protector. If a woman is going to attach herself to a man, she needs to know his strength is genuine, not just a facade. So she will subconsciously employ shit tests, she will challenge his decisions, tease him aggressively, or create an awkward social dynamic. She is testing his emotional rock solidness. Frame control is essentially about whose reality is dominant in the relationship.
Right.
If a man gets defensive, angry, flustered, or overly apologetic when challenged, he fails the test. His frame shatters. He proves he is easily destabilized, but if he stays calm, amused, and assertive, he passes. He proves he is a steady rock, which deeply satisfies her biological need for a competent leader.
It's fascinating how much of this operates completely below the level of conscious thought. To illustrate just how deeply biological our attractions are, the book brings up a famous historical anecdote involving Napoleon Bonaparte and his wife, Josephine. I read this part and just laughed out loud because it is so raw. Napoleon is out on a military campaign, and he writes a letter to Josephine saying, "I am coming home in 3 days, don't wash."
Yes, the famous letter.
It sounds bizarre to the modern ear, but what is the evolutionary science behind that?
It's all about pheromones and the major histocompatibility complex, or MHC. MHC is a set of genes involved in the immune system. Studies have shown that humans are subconsciously attracted to the natural scent of individuals with an MHC genetic makeup that is distinctly different from their own. This evolutionary mechanism ensures that offspring will have a more diverse and robust immune system. Napoleon wasn't just being eccentric, he was driven by an invisible chemical signal that communicated deep genetic compatibility. Our modern obsession with masking every natural odor with perfumes and deodorants actually interferes with this primal mating radar.
And the book points out that the biological signaling is a two-way street. It mentions the cocktail party phenomena, which I found mind-blowing. The research shows that a woman's voice actually changes depending on where she is in her menstrual cycle. During the peak of her ovulation, when she is most fertile, her voice becomes slightly higher pitched and subconsciously more attractive to men.
Unbelievable, right?
Yeah, men at a cocktail party will naturally gravitate toward the women who are ovulating without having any logical idea why. These are the subtle, unconscious cues dictating human mating dances, completely overriding any conscious feminist theory or societal construct.
It absolutely overrides it. The text also delves into male biological imperatives, specifically citing the Coolidge effect. The story goes that President Calvin Coolidge and his wife were touring a poultry farm. Mrs. Coolidge noticed a rooster mating very frequently and asked the farmer to point this out to the president. The president asked the farmer, "Is it with the same hen every time?" The farmer replied, "No, Mr. President, a different one each time." The president smiled and said, "Tell that to Mrs. Coolidge."
That's a great story.
It illustrates the biological urge for sexual variety in males, the evolutionary drive to propagate genes as widely as possible. The author points out that understanding this deep-seated urge is necessary for modern men to manage it effectively and channel their energy, rather than letting it sabotage their long-term legacy goals.
But biology isn't just about attraction, it's also about time. And the book emphasizes a harsh ticking clock, which the author calls the wall. This is the unavoidable reality of female fertility. A woman's fertility peaks in her early to mid-20s and begins a rapid, steady decline after the age of 35. And this creates a massively shifting power dynamic in the dating market over time.
It's a brutal truth of the sexual marketplace that mainstream narratives often try to soften or ignore. A woman's sexual market value, or SMV, is heavily tied to her youth and fertility. Therefore, her leverage is highest when she is young. A man's SMV, however, is not tied to his youth. It is tied to his resources, status, and competence traits that take decades to build. Therefore, a man's SMV can actually peak in his late 30s, 40s, or even 50s. The power dynamic completely inverts as a generation ages.
And the author is highly critical of modern technological attempts to circumvent this biological reality. He specifically attacks the trend of social freezing, where women freeze their eggs in their 30s to delay childbearing to focus on their careers. He views it as a flawed insurance policy. Why is he so dismissive of this technology?
The author argues that social freezing gives women a false sense of security. It allows them to buy into the corporate narrative that they can have it all on their own timeline. But the text points out that the success rates of IVF with frozen eggs vary wildly and are far from guaranteed. More importantly, it ignores the physical and energetic realities of raising children. Having a child at 45 means you are dealing with a teenager when you are 60. The author argues that delaying family formation for corporate middle management is a catastrophic trade-off that leaves many women ultimately childless and deeply unfulfilled, having wasted their peak SMV years chasing a masculine metric of success.
Okay, so this brings us to a critical juncture. If the game is wired this way by biology, and the modern rules have been skewed by societal narratives that punish masculinity, how does a man actually survive and thrive? The author introduces what he calls the masculinity paradox. Society constantly tells men to be the rock, to be stoic providers, but mainstream culture and modern psychology simultaneously shame men for not being emotionally vulnerable. Yet, as we discussed, the moment a man actually breaks down and shows true vulnerability, his partner subconsciously perceives him as weak. It's a trap. How does the book suggest men navigate this minefield?
What's fascinating here is how the author contextualizes this paradox within broader systemic failures that leave men feeling displaced. The book points out that the modern gig economy has stripped millions of men of the ability to be stable, single income providers, replacing secure careers with precarious gig based hustle. Simultaneously, the modern education system is systematically failing boys.
Oh, massively.
The text argues that schools are essentially designed for female temperament rewarding sitting still, compliance, and verbal acuity, while penalizing natural male energy, competitiveness, and restlessness. So men are entering the dating market economically disadvantaged and educationally demoralized.
So, how do you reclaim your identity when the system is supposedly designed against you? The author's solution is ancient: radical acceptance and stoicism. If you can't change the gynocracy, you must absolutely master your own mind.
Stoicism is presented as the perfect philosophical countermeasure to an unpredictable, chaotic, and often hostile environment. The text heavily cites the great Stoic philosophers Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus. The core tenet applied here is the dichotomy of control. You cannot control external events. You cannot control the swipe algorithms. You cannot control family court biases. You cannot control the feminist narrative. And you cannot control female biological hypergamy. But you have absolute sovereign control over your reaction to these realities.
And the examples the author uses to illustrate this are fantastic. He points to the movie Fight Club, specifically the character of Tyler Durden, as an extreme example of emotional detachment. Now, obviously Tyler Durden is a chaotic anarchist, but the author highlights his specific ability to remain completely calm, collected, and physically relaxed, even in the face of absolute chaos or physical threat. While extreme, the ability to stay composed under pressure is the exact trait that passes a woman's shit test. It signals ultimate competence.
He also uses contemporary examples like Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson and LeBron James. These men represent towering physical masculinity, but the author highlights their exceptionally high emotional intelligence, or EQ. They are calm under pressure, they handle intense media scrutiny and adversity without throwing tantrums or breaking frame. They lead their teams and families with steady hands. The text argues that true stoicism isn't about being an unfeeling robot. It's about experiencing emotion, but expressing it from a position of absolute strength and control rather than reactive weakness.
But my favorite example in the book is Theodore Roosevelt. The author holds him up as the ultimate paragon of a growth mindset, delayed gratification, and what he terms amused mastery. Roosevelt wasn't born a tough guy. He was a sickly, asthmatic child. But he essentially willed himself into a robust, adventurous, hypermasculine figure through sheer discipline and the strenuous life. How does the concept of amused mastery tie into navigating the modern dating market?
Amused mastery is perhaps the most powerful psychological tool the book offers. If a man can view the chaos of the modern dating market not as a personal, malicious attack on his worth, but as an amusing, predictable game governed by biological rules, he becomes essentially impervious to emotional manipulation. If a woman ghosts him or tries to neg him, a man operating with amused mastery doesn't get angry or send a bitter text. He chuckles, recognizes the behavior for what it is, and moves on. He maintains his value because his validation comes entirely from his internal frame, not from the external validation of women. He's the director of his own movie.
Here's where it gets really interesting. We've talked about the mindset. A man has adopted stoicism. He understands the biological market. But how does he actually elevate his sexual market value in the real world? How does he become the top 20%? The author emphasizes that the absolute foundation is having a life purpose that supersedes women.
Drawing heavily on the work of Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist who wrote Man's Search for Meaning After Surviving the Holocaust, the author argues that a man with a clear, driving, transcendent purpose is incredibly magnetic. It shows ambition, resilience, and direction. Whether it's building a business, excelling in a demanding career, or mastering a complex craft, a man who is actively pursuing a monumental goal is far more attractive than a man whose sole focus is chasing women. A man must be on his purpose. Women are meant to complement that journey, not be the destination.
And part of that journey is curating your environment. The book brings up the famous Jim Rohn rule, the idea that you are the exact average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. If your social circle consists of unambitious, defeated men who complain about the dating market and play video games all day, you will reflect that low value. A red-pilled man must actively build a brotherhood. He needs strong, supportive, high-value men around him. This provides emotional resilience, accountability, and vastly expands networking and dating opportunities.
Once the foundation of purpose and brotherhood is laid, the text breaks down the literal mechanics of seduction, and it's not about memorizing pickup lines. The author points out a widely cited psychological metric. 55% of human communication is entirely nonverbal. Your body language, your vocal tonality, your eye contact, and your spatial awareness speak volumes before you ever open your mouth. A high-value man moves with deliberate purpose, takes up space comfortably without being aggressive, and speaks with a resonant, calm tone from his chest, not his throat.
And this leads to a massive concept in the seduction community that the author strongly reinforces: the power of pre-selection. Let's dive into that. Pre-selection is a documented psychological phenomenon where women are biologically wired to desire men that other women already find desirable. It's the ultimate form of social proof. If a man walks into a room and is comfortably chatting and laughing with attractive women, other women immediately perceive him as a high-value, safe, and desirable mate. It completely bypasses the logical, critical part of the brain. If other women have vetted him, he must be worth it.
It's a shortcut for the female evolutionary radar. But the author strongly cautions that elevating your SFVV, mastering nonverbal communication, and utilizing preselection is only half the battle. If you do all that just to secure a low-quality partner, you've wasted your effort. You must use that elevated value to identify, vet, and secure a truly high-value woman. He warns men not to be blinded by mere physical beauty. He compares a beautiful woman with a toxic character to a flashy, high-end sports car with no engine. It looks great in the driveway, but it will leave you stranded and bankrupt.
So what exactly is the standard? To define what a high-value man should be looking for, the author introduces a concept that mainstream media often refers to as the Michelle Obama standard. What does he mean by that in this context?
The Michelle Obama standard in this text refers to a woman who brings her own goals, her own intellect, her own education, and her own emotional stability to the table. She isn't just looking for a man to rescue her, pay off her debts, or fund a lavish lifestyle. She is an asset. She is a woman who can stand back to back with a strong leader and help build an empire. She has high character, loyalty, and the capacity for deep partnership, rather than just being an ornamental dependent.
And the author is equally, if not more, adamant about identifying red flags and absolute deal breakers early on. The book provides a ruthless checklist for vetting. He lists women who constantly bring drama into their lives, women who have a history of highly dysfunctional, chaotic relationships, or women who employ manipulative, cluster B personality tactics. He explicitly warns against women who use gaslighting, manipulating a man into questioning his own memory or sanity, or who use hoovering. Hoovering is a sinister tactic where a toxic ex tries to suck a man back into a cycle of abuse right when he finally tries to move on and establish boundaries.
The text illustrates the catastrophic consequences of ignoring these red flags with some brutal pop culture contrasts. The most prominent example used is Johnny Depp's disastrous marriage to Amber Heard. The author argues that Depp, despite having immense wealth, status, and SMV, completely ignored massive red flags and manipulative tendencies because he was blinded by her extreme physical beauty. The result was a highly public, humiliating, and destructive legal battle, massive financial loss, and severe damage to his legacy. The lesson is that no amount of status protects you from a toxic partner if you fail to vet them.
On the flip side, the book points to Oprah Winfrey. While she isn't traditionally discussed in the manosphere, the author uses her as a prime example of a woman who overcame a horrific, chaotic, abusive past to build incredible stability, emotional intelligence, and monumental success. She proves that a high-value woman takes absolute responsibility for her own healing and doesn't project her trauma onto her partner. He also points to Kate Middleton, noting that her stable, close-knit, highly supportive family background was a massive indicator of her character. Her background predicted her ability to handle the extreme, suffocating pressures of her eventual royal marriage with total poise, loyalty, and dignity.
It's a very calculated, almost clinical approach to vetting a partner. The author is telling men that they must be ruthless in their evaluation. You are interviewing someone for the most important role in your life's enterprise. You must evaluate her character, her family background, her relationship with her father, and her conflict resolution skills before ever considering the ultimate step of commitment.
Which brings us to the final, and perhaps most crucial phase of the book. We've covered the market, the biology, the mindset, and the vetting. Now we arrive at the culmination, the framework of marriage, legacy, and global perspectives. The author views modern marriage without any romantic, Disney-fied illusions. He states plainly that marriage is a binding legal contract with profound, life-altering consequences primarily for men.
Given his earlier assertions about the extreme bias of family courts against fathers and the statistical reality that women initiate the vast majority of divorces, the author argues that entering a modern Western marriage without a prenuptial agreement is financial suicide. He compares it to signing a complex, multi-million-dollar business merger without reading the terms and conditions or having an exit strategy. A prenup is not unromantic. The text argues it is a vital, mature tool to outline financial expectations and protect hard-earned assets. It allows both parties to enter the union with clear eyes, removing the financial incentive for divorce, which actually reduces underlying anxiety.
But obviously, a legal document doesn't keep a family together. Beyond the legalities, what holds a marriage together in a culture that the author believes is actively trying to tear the nuclear family apart? The book leans heavily into the absolute necessity of traditional values and, in many cases, religion. The argument is that shared values, faith, and a mutual understanding of traditional complementary gender roles, where the man unequivocally leads and provides a framework of security, and the woman nurtures, supports, and manages the internal life of the family, create a highly stable, harmonious environment.
This raises an important question about how we build resilient communities in an increasingly isolated, digitized age. The author references the prominent political scientist Robert Putnam and his concept of social capital from the book Bowling Alone. Establishing rigorous family rituals is presented as the antidote to modern isolation. Whether that's attending a religious service weekly, having a non-negotiable, screens-off Sunday family dinner, or creating specific, deeply meaningful holiday traditions, these actions build social capital within the family unit. It creates a shared history, a sense of belonging, and a web of mutual obligation that acts as a fortress against the external stresses that tear modern marriages apart.
And speaking of stress, the book highlights that financial friction is one of the top destroyers of legacy. The author insists that couples must be absolutely aligned on money. You have to actively avoid lifestyle creep, the trap where your expenses rise just as fast as your income to impress people you don't even like, keeping you in a perpetual state of financial anxiety and wage slavery. You have to be on the exact same page about wealth building, investing, and passing down a legacy to your children.
Furthermore, to maintain the internal health of the marriage, the author brings in the renowned communication theories of Dr. John Gottman. Gottman's decades of research found that contempt, rolling the eyes, mocking, speaking with superiority is the #1 predictor of divorce. The author advises men that while they must lead the household and maintain their assertive frame, they must never resort to contemptuous language, and they must not tolerate it from their partner. He also emphasizes the importance of responding to a partner's bids for connection. These are the small, everyday attempts to engage emotionally. A comment about the weather, a sigh, a touch. Ignoring these bids breeds deep isolation and resentment over time. A strong leader is attentive to his team.
Now, I want to spend some real time on this next part because the text broadens its scope significantly to give this all context. The author explores global perspectives on love and marriage to prove a vital point. The modern, app-driven Western dating market is an absolute historical anomaly. It's not the only way humans organize mating. The book looks at different cultures to show how they enforce structure. Let's start with the Christmas cake phenomenon in Japan. What is the author highlighting here?
The Christmas cake phenomenon is a slightly older but highly illustrative Japanese cultural metaphor. A Christmas cake is meant to be eaten on the 25th. After the 25th, it is heavily discounted and considered past its prime. Historically in Japan, this metaphor was applied to unmarried women over the age of 25. While the specific age may have shifted slightly in modern times, the cultural pressure remains intense. The author uses this to show that other highly advanced civilized societies openly acknowledge the biological reality of the wall. They exert immense societal pressure to ensure family formation happens during peak fertility years, rather than indulging the Western fantasy that a woman can indefinitely delay marriage without consequences to her SMV.
The book also takes a really deep look at Islamic marriage traditions, specifically the concept of mahr. In the West, we have the looming threat of alimony, which the author argues incentivizes divorce. How does the Islamic mahr contrast with this?
This is a fascinating structural comparison. The mahr is a mandatory, legally binding gift, often money, property, or gold, given by the groom directly to the bride at the time of the Islamic marriage contract. It becomes her sole independent property. The author highlights this as a traditional upfront mechanism designed to ensure the immediate financial security of the bride, formally establishing the provider role of the man from day one. Unlike Western alimony, which is an open-ended post-divorce extraction of wealth that can cripple a man, the mar is defined and settled at the beginning. It highlights how different cultures formalize the provider role while mitigating the catastrophic back-end risks associated with Western family courts.
The book even looks at cross-cultural success stories to show that a strong frame and shared vision can transcend vastly different backgrounds. The author cites the late UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, a Ghanaian diplomat, and his marriage to a Swedish wife, Nananem. He also brings up the marriage of supermodel Gisele Bündchen and NFL quarterback Tom Brady. Now, obviously Brady and Bündchen eventually divorced, but the text uses the long tenure of their marriage to show that when two incredibly high-value, high-status individuals align their goals and operate at the peak of their respective hierarchies, they can bridge massive cultural and geographic gaps. It requires immense communication, but it shows that high value recognizes high value across borders.
And finally, regarding global or at least alternative perspectives, the author points to the Amish. Not because he wants his readers to churn their own butter, but he looks at their specific approach to technology as a model for mindful family living. The Amish do not blindly adopt new technology. They rigorously evaluate whether a new tool will strengthen the family and community bonds or weaken them. If it weakens the family, they reject it. The author suggests modern families must adopt this exact mindset regarding smartphones, social media, and algorithmic entertainment to protect their children from the toxic narratives of the wider culture.
So what does this all mean? We've covered a massive, comprehensive amount of ground today. We've gone from the digital algorithms of Tinder to the evolutionary biology of pheromones, from Stoic philosophy to the intricacies of international marriage contracts. The author's ultimate call to action for his readers is unequivocal and uncompromising. Men must actively reject societal emasculation. You cannot passively wait for the culture to respect you. You must take radical, unapologetic responsibility for building your sexual market value. You must lead your life and your relationships with strength, assertiveness, and unshakable stoicism. And ultimately, you must do the rigorous vetting required to marry above your station, because building a generational legacy requires a man to take absolute, sovereign charge of his destiny.
It is a profound, demanding, and highly systematic philosophy. It asks men to view their lives as an empire they are building. But as we reflect on the author's deeply biological and evolutionary arguments regarding human attraction, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought that extends beyond the pages of this book. If our deepest attractions, our hypergamous drives, and our intricate mating behaviors are truly unalterably hardwired by millions of years of evolutionary biology, as this text forcefully argues, how will the impending rise of highly advanced, emotionally responsive artificial intelligence companions fundamentally alter the trajectory of human evolution and the dating market? Will AI completely level the playing field by providing disenfranchised men with hyper-compliant, flawless emotional support and companionship? Or will it break the biological system entirely, removing the evolutionary pressure and the primary motivation for men to endure the struggle of elevating their SMV in the real world?
Wow, that is a heavy, mind-expanding, and honestly slightly terrifying question to chew on. Something for you to mull over as you navigate your own path through the modern marketplace. Before we wrap up, I want to remind you one last time to please hit that like button and subscribe to the deep dive so you never miss a thorough, uncompromising analysis like this one. If you want to read the source material, analyze the data, and judge it for yourself, go to Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books right now to purchase Elevate Your Love Life. Marry Above Your Station by Conrad Riker, and make absolutely sure you follow @Conrad Riker on Substack to keep up with his latest strategies and writings.
Thank you for engaging with this dense, challenging material with an open, analytical mind. Understanding the architecture of these arguments is the first step to mastering your own environment.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining this deep dive. Stay sharp, and we'll see you next time.